Hi everyone, welcome to Milo e-learning. That's mindful, intelligent learning opportunities. Today we're discussing the transatlantic slave trade. That's history term 2. Our focus today is on West Africa before the European slave trade. Now, before we start, we need to understand what slavery is. Now, slavery basically refers to the practice of owning another person. Now, that means owning somebody with not giving them any money or appreciating the work that they do. And I say not giving them any money, that means that we not paying them a salary. Another word for salary is remuneration. Right. Now, the people that in West Africa that were slaves were either captured in a battle, or they were criminals, or they were chased away from their families or their local societies, or they were brought in to perform unskilled or domestic labor, and some of them were used as soldiers. Now, the slaves were not paid for their work, but they were treated quite well. They were given food, drink, clothing, and shelter for the work that they did. Now, the Africans that employed the slaves followed this strict rule by treating them honorably and fairly. So they could lead good lives. They could marry, the slaves could marry, they could own land, houses, and they were quite well educated. But soon after a while, the rules of slavery changed, and let's see how it did. Now, by the 7th century, the Arabs came over, and also in Mali, Mansa Musa decided to buy slaves. And this is when everything took a turn for the worst. The slaves were traded, and they went to North Africa, to the Middle East, and also to the Southern Europe. Now, the Mansa Musa, he raided the weaker neighborhoods, and then he sold the slaves as their captives as slaves. And he kept some for his own use, where he kept them to work as soldiers in their army, and also to work in their gold mine, and also to farm on their land. And sometimes the slaves were even exchanged for horses. Can you believe that 15 to 20 slaves were exchanged just for one Arabian horse? Wow. Right. Now, this is a picture of how the slaves looked prior to the transatlantic slave. And if you look at the map, now this was the Kingdom of Mali, and the slaves were traded for in the northern Africa and also towards the Middle East by the Arabs. Now, if we continue to this transatlantic slaves, so the slaves were captured from West Africa, and then they were transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and they were sold at auctions to work in plantations in America. Now, the slaves this was regarded as the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, now the Europeans basically colonized different parts of the world, and this basically changed the whole idea of slave trade. And now, when this change came about, the slave trade was now called chattelry. Right. Now, chattel slaves were derived from the name cattle, where cattle was traded for cattle. Now, instead of cattle being traded for cattle, we were trading slaves for slaves. Now, the slaves were taken from West Africa. They were basically treated quite badly. They were not treated the way normal people were treated. They were subjected to brutal treatment. If they remained slaves for their whole lives, and if they had children, their children became slaves as well. And they were forced to do work by their owner. They did not receive any wages, and also they had no rights. They were not allowed to even learn to read or write. Now, Britain was one of the countries that colonized most of the countries in the world. Now, they went to America and they formed 13 colonies in America. Now, this was before America became the United States of America. Okay. Now, when they went there, the indigenous Americans that lived there were subjected to force and violence, and they conquered them and made the colonies. Now, the British used powerful weapons, and the indigenous people resisted, and most of them died. Also, the colonizers brought diseases on that long trip that they traveled over to America. They brought diseases like smallpox, measles, flu, and the indigenous people did not have immunity against these diseases, and they died. Right, so the colonists needed people to work now. So they went to West Africa and they brought slaves across to America. Now, these were all the 13 colonies in America, the initial colonies. It's on the map on the right. Now, they brought them to work on plantations, and the plantations were the tobacco plantations, rice plantations, sugarcane, and also the cotton plantations. Now, the colonies became the original states of the USA and the early provinces of Canada. And this was where the slaves from Africa were first brought in. And the colonists moved south and they also moved west and they formed big farms, and these were called the plantations. Now, the products like rice, tobacco, sugarcane, and cotton were grown, and they were called cash crops. And this was sold for profit, and it was not used at all on the farm or eaten. It was just sold. And this boosted the economy of America, and it became agriculture based, and the Americans became very wealthy through these cash crops. Right, we're going to move on. In the 1760s, an argument broke up between the 13 colonies and the British, and a war broke out because they disagreed on certain things. They basically wanted their independence. So in 1776, the colonists declared their independence from Britain, and in 1783, the United States of America was created. Right, the Declaration of Independence was drawn up where they said that everyone was treated equally. Now, the Declaration of Independence was misleading because the slaves were not treated equally. They could not own land, vote, or own a house. Now, this led the American independence to be regarded as hypocritical. Now, hypocrisy means that when you pretend to have certain beliefs, but you actually don't have those beliefs. Now, the reasons for using the slave labor was because, one, they did not have enough people to work on the plantations. Two, they wanted to monopolize their money. That means that they did not want other people to claim their land by working, because if workers worked, they had a right to claim the land. But if the slaves worked, that means that the owners of the property owned the slaves, and they didn't have to spend money for wages or labor, or even give land to the people that worked on the land. So they mistreated their slaves because they thought that there was a good supply of slaves, and it increased their profits by not paying for labor. Now, the transatlantic slave started in 1619 and it ended in 1865. And here you could see in the picture, they went from America all the way to, they went from Africa all the way to America, and some of them also even went to Europe. Now, the European slaves traders kidnapped people from West Africa. Some of them were sold by their chiefs from their land, and they were caught by their own African fellow African people. And they was exchanged for things like guns, whiskey, cloth, metal goods, knives, and even basins. Now, the European slave traders set up bases where these captives were sent to them, and they were held in barracoons. And when they were caught, they were branded with a red hot iron and marked as a slave. And this was the start of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, join me next time for to learn about the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, what it had on them, and how they revolted. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.